What is up, everyone? Welcome back to GrayDays TV, and today I am going to be talking about Mark Kilroy, a University of Texas student who was kidnapped and later murdered while on spring break in Mexico. So let's get right into it. Mark James Kilroy was born on March 5th, 1968 in Chicago, Illinois. His parents were James William and Helen Josephine. Mark grew up in Santa Fe, Texas, a small town outside of Houston, and excelled both academically and athletically as a teenager. And he played sports like basketball, baseball, and golf with his friends. Upon graduation in 1986, he attended Southwest Texas State University, but he later transferred to the University of Texas at Austin to become a pre-med student. On March 10th, 1989, Kilroy's childhood friend Bradley Moore finished exams early at Texas A&M University and headed to Austin to pick him up. Both of them headed to Santa Fe to pick up two other friends, Bill Huddleston and Brent Martin, before heading to South Padre Island, Texas for spring break. That Sunday, the four left South Padre Island and stopped at a Sonic to get some food while on their way to Matamoros. And that's where they met a group of female students from the University of Kansas who were also planning to drive to Mexico to party that night. The girls then followed Brent's car from Port Isabel to Brownsville and parked their cars close to the Gateway International Bridge before crossing the U.S.-Mexico border by foot. Once across the bridge, their first stop was a club called Sgt. Pepper's. And the guys stayed there till about 2:30 before they ended up heading back to their hotel. And they had so much fun the previous night that they decided to go back to Mexico again the next night, after they stopped at one of Mark's fraternity brothers' condo parties. And for the second time, they parked their car on the American side of the bridge and just walked over to the Mexican side. And the sidewalks, the streets, and the nightclubs were all packed with spring breakers, and that was because that the Mexican drinking laws were a lot more lax than the American drinking laws. So you could be younger, come across the border, and buy cheap beer and all this stuff and be good, and you couldn't do that in America. So that was a place where a lot of tourists would just cross the bridge, have fun, and then return home afterwards. So they had another good time, and then around 2 a.m. they decided that it'd be a good time to probably head back to the hotel. So Bradley and Brent walked ahead, and Mark and Bill were a little further behind. Not that far behind, but they were a little further behind. And Mark ended up having to wait for Bill because he went into an alleyway to use the bathroom. And that was when everything happened. So Bill just assumed that Mark was ahead with Bradley and Brent. But once he got there, they quickly realized that Mark wasn't with either of the groups, but they weren't too concerned at the time. They stayed behind and looked for him, but they didn't think any foul play was involved at that point. They just thought maybe he saw someone he knew and he just talked to them and sort of lost track of time. Now, they ended up staying in Mexico till about 4:30 because they were looking for him. They weren't too concerned, but they still looked for him because of course you're going to look for your friend. And they stayed around until about 4:30, and then that's when they finally walked across the border back to where their car was, thinking that maybe he was there. But again, he wasn't there either. So now they're still a little concerned, but at the same time, you're drunk, you kind of convince yourself, okay, well, he probably got a ride with someone else back to the hotel. And I mean, cell phones weren't a thing, so they couldn't just call him. So they just assumed, okay, he's back at the hotel. He probably got a ride with someone else, so we're just gonna go ahead and head back. But when they woke up the next day and Mark still wasn't there and they still had no idea where he was, that's when they decided to call the police and report him missing. And I don't really see anything wrong with how they reacted to the situation. You gotta keep in mind that they were drunk at the time, and of course you're gonna convince yourself that, okay, yeah, he's not here, but he probably got a ride with someone else. We saw him throughout the night talking to other people, talking to girls who we also saw at our hotel, so we're not too worried. If he went with them, then he's probably at the hotel. So you're going to convince yourself that everything's okay. And unfortunately, this time around, everything wasn't okay. Usually it does work out that way, but he wasn't there, and they did the right thing. They immediately, after they woke up, they contacted the police and reported him missing. So I don't see anything wrong with how the friends reacted to the entire situation and how they handled the situation. But what happened to Mark? So as Mark stood on the street waiting for Bill to come back from the alley, he was lured to a red truck by a man who called him and asked him, hey, do you need a ride? So Mark walked up to him, and as soon as he got close enough, he was grabbed and put into the vehicle. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Mark played baseball, he played basketball. He was pretty athletic, and because of that, he was able to actually get away from the guys and run for about 2 blocks before he was caught by another car that was with the first car, and then wrestled back into the car and abducted. Now, the men who abducted him took him to a private ranch known as the Santa Elena, and they left Mark inside the car overnight. Now, shortly after dawn, the caretaker of the ranch came to Mark, and actually they fed him. Now, about 12 hours after he was initially taken, some men come to the car, they tape his face and mouth with duct tape, and they take him to a shack. And throughout the night, he was tortured. And after being tortured for a little while, he was led to a field, and that is where the man who murdered him took a machete and chopped the back of his neck and sort of the back of his head, and that is what killed Mark Kilroy. His brain was then put into a metal pot with other items, and his legs were chopped off above the knee. There wasn't really a purpose for his legs being chopped off above the knee other than to help the people bury him easier. And all of this took place within about 12 hours of his initial kidnapping. So from the time that the official search for Mark started, he was probably, if not dead already, very close to being dead. But now I want to talk about the search that went into finding him. So the search for Mark Kilroy actually started off as a pretty generic missing persons case. Most people who ended up going missing in that part of Mexico usually were found the next day very hungover and not really sure what happened to them the night before, but it was never a case where, or it was rarely a case where it ended up as bad as it ended up with Mark Kilroy. And Mark was actually one of about 60 people who had disappeared in that area in the first 3 months of 1989. However, Mark's case drew a lot more attention than most, especially in the United States, because his uncle was a US customs agent. But unfortunately, because in this certain part of Mexico, it depends so much on tourism, they initially tried to deflect the blame on what happened to Mark or where he went missing, and saying that it happened in the American side in Brownsville instead of the Mexican side, the Mexico side. But thankfully, his friends were very steadfast in saying that no, he didn't disappear in Brownsville, he disappeared while we were in Mexico. So the search again shifted to that area more specifically than the Brownsville area, which was the US area. And both the US and Mexican authorities felt that there was probably some foul play involved in Mark's disappearance. More specifically, they thought that Mark was probably a victim of a drug-related kidnapping or a robbery killing, but they didn't really have any evidence to back up these sort of thoughts or these theories that they had, but they just assumed out of everything that could have happened, those are probably the most likely to have happened to Mark. And like I said, as soon as his friends reported him missing, there was a lot of action taking place to find him. They sent pictures of him to all the jails and hospitals around that area to see if he maybe ended up in one of those places. And investigators even hired a hypnosis to put his friends under so that maybe they could give more information than they thought they knew at the time. And that actually ended up being pretty helpful, because one of his friends, Bradley, actually, after going under hypnosis, remembered that he saw a Mexican man with a scar on his face call out to Mark and sort of ask him if he needed a ride or if he knew him from somewhere else. But none of his friends were able to pinpoint exactly where this conversation took place or where Mark was last seen. So they immediately got the Border Patrol to use helicopters and terrain vehicles to search the area looking for a body, because at that point they figured that he was probably robbed and killed, and then they went and dumped his body somewhere. But his body was not found, and they were checking near the Rio Grande River and the areas that surrounded it. Meanwhile, Mark's mom and dad flew to Brownsville and actually were the head of the investigation. And they stayed in a few weeks. They did everything they could to find their son. They circulated thousands of leaflets, and they even offered $15,000 to any information that would help them find their son. And on the 26th of March, Mark Kilroy's case was actually covered on the television show America's Most Wanted. And they got a lot of attention by putting this on the television show, but none of the information they got helped them in the case in any way. And a few days later, Mark's parents did have to go back home, but they vowed to work as hard as they could to find their son. But the break in the case actually ended up coming from a completely different source. A few days before the Kilroys left to go back home, the United States and Mexico actually announced a joint effort to crack down on drug distribution between the United States and Mexican border. The anti-drug operation actually included over 1,200 agents, a dozen helicopters, and over 30 airplanes. So on April 1st, 1989, Mexican authorities were stationed at a routine checkpoint near Santa Elena when they saw a vehicle that ran through the checkpoint without stopping. And they later found out that the man who drove past this checkpoint was actually one of the men who kidnapped Mark. So the Mexican authorities took an unmarked car to follow the car that ran through the checkpoint, and they followed him to a privately owned ranch, which is when they sort of turned off so he wouldn't realize they were following him, and let him just go into the ranch. So the car actually ended up leaving about 30 minutes later, and that is when the police decided to drive into the ranch and sort of just do a quick investigation. And in that investigation, they discovered cult paraphernalia and traces of marijuana. But instead of immediately turning around and trying to find that car and arrest the person driving, they actually did something really smart. They waited a little while longer, and they just sort of surveyed the area for a couple of days or so to get more evidence on the people who lived in the ranch. And on April 9th, they returned with several other officers and arrested 5 people at the ranch, including the caretaker. And now while in custody, they sent the other 4 directly to prison, basically, and they interrogated the caretaker, the ranch caretaker. And while they were questioning him, they showed him a picture of Mark, just because that was something that they were just so used to doing at that point. And he actually identified Mark and said that he was at the ranch at one point. And when the police questioned one of the other men who were arrested at the ranch, he actually admitted to kidnapping Mark and helping in the murder of Mark. He then identified the leader, a man named Costanzo, I hope I'm saying that right, and said that he ordered the killings as part of a sacrificial ritual. And Costanzo believed that by sacrificing people, the people who were committing the murders would be granted strength and basically invincibility against their enemies. And specifically, he told the police that the only reason that Mark was killed was because Costanzo, their leader, told them that they needed to find a gringo to kill. So Mark's death was basically happened by chance. If he wasn't at that place at that time, he probably wouldn't have been the person that was killed. Somebody else would have got killed. It could have easily have been one of his friends or just someone else that was in the area at the time. And that just makes it even more horrible that it happened to someone that you could just kill someone randomly. I'll never be able to understand that. And on April 11th, the men who were originally arrested at the ranch were taken back to the ranch, and they were forced by police to show them where they buried Mark and where they buried the other people who were killed. And they were actually forced at gunpoint to dig up these bodies for several hours. And after it was all said and done, they ended up digging up about 15 different bodies, including Mark's, all men who had been kidnapped within a 9-month period. And Mark's body was officially identified using dental records. And other than Mark, the rest of the bodies that they found at the ranch actually belonged to rival drug dealers. So Mark was the only random person who was kidnapped and sacrificed. The police also seized a ton of drugs and weapons, and they also found a pot that had a human brain, a goat's head, chicken feet, a turtle, several herbs, a horseshoe, and coins mixed with animal blood. But there was no signs of cannibalism found. And that is very important because once the media found out what happened to Mark, they immediately went and said that the cult were Satanist cannibals, which wasn't true. The cult was just drug dealers who performed these ancient rituals that they thought helped them become invincible and just immune to police and rival gangs. There was no Satan worship involved or anything like that. They were just drug dealers who believed in ancient rituals. And that's a misconception that was spread around a lot initially after they found Mark's body and word got out. And on April 13th, his parents actually held a memorial service for him. It didn't initially start as a memorial service. It started as sort of a way to keep morale high in the search for Mark, but once they got the news, it was turned to a memorial service. And when Mark's parents found out exactly what happened to Mark, they weren't angry. I mean, they were sad, of course, but once his father was told that Mark was alive about 12 hours after he was initially kidnapped, he actually found the bright side of that situation and said, well, hopefully Mark was able to find his peace with God and he was able to go to heaven once he died. So his parents were very much Christians, and they believed that if you did ask for forgiveness, if you were a good person, you would end up in heaven. So when they got the news, they immediately thought, okay, well, at least now our son is happy and safe and he's in heaven with God. So I'm happy that his parents were able to immediately find the good and the horrible thing that happened to their son. Now, later on, everyone who was involved in the murder of Mark Kilroy were found. The leader, Costanzo, I really hope I'm saying the name right. I'm really bad with that. But he was found, and before he could be arrested, he ordered some other members of the cult to kill him so he wouldn't be arrested and put in jail. So he died, unfortunately. I'm sure that people would much rather he be arrested, but he got what he deserved as far as I'm concerned. I don't like that he kind of got to choose how he went out, but because Mexico doesn't have the death penalty anyway, he would have just spent the rest of his life in prison, which, I don't know, I guess now that I think about it, I think that would be a better punishment, staying in prison for the rest of your life. I just feel like when you kill someone, it's quick, it's easy, and it's over with. And maybe that's not fair for them because they did such horrible things. They deserve to sit there for however long they have left in their life and think about what they did. And maybe they don't think about it. Maybe they enjoy prison and they have a great time. I mean, some people do. But I'd rather them have a chance to just sit there and think about what they did than just initially just killing them immediately. 2 months after Mark was confirmed dead, his parents founded the Mark Kilroy Foundation, which promotes drug awareness, education, and prevention through the Just Say No campaign. And besides counseling kids and teenagers with drug advice, Kilroy's parents also advise young people who plan to travel for spring break, suggesting to stay in groups, keep an eye on each other, and not wander off on their own. And I'm glad that they were able to find peace in their son's murder, and that they didn't let that destroy their lives. They did good things for the community. They found a way to turn this horrible situation into something that helped not only themselves but others. I'm sure that you guys have noticed that I didn't really mention a lot about the people who did this crime. I don't want to spread their names around, for one. Two, I'm really bad with names, and some of their names are really hard to pronounce. So that was another reason why I just sort of left their names out of it. But they're not important in this case. Mark is. He was an innocent kid enjoying spring break, randomly taken and murdered for strange reasons. And that's unfortunate. You have to make sure, you have to remain safe. Like his parents are trying to preach to other kids, when you're going somewhere that you're not familiar with, always stay in a somewhat large group and be aware of your surroundings, because people are crazy out here and you never know what they're going to try and do to you. So that's the end of this video. That's all I have to say about it. Let me know what you guys think. I'm going to leave more information if you do want to learn more about the people who were behind this murder and what their thought process was and things like that. But until next time, have a great day, great week, great month, great year. And I will see you guys next video.